Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So today's conversation is with a woman by the name of Wendy Gritter. I'm slowly becoming her new biggest fan. Not slowly, quickly becoming her new biggest fan. Sorry about that, Wendy. And you're going to really enjoy this conversation today, I think. It's fun, it's interesting, we have a few laughs, but we also talk about some pretty interesting things. We talk about our over-sexualized culture and what it means to be heteronormative. And we talk about sexuality in a really interesting way. Wendy works with an organization called Direction Ministries, and she is working within a faith-based community or faith-based communities. She's talking about things like human flourishing, and she talks today about what it means to be the walking wounded, sexuality versus justice. What does it mean to have a principled pluralism? You're going to enjoy this talk. She's got a book by the name of Generous Spaciousness. Check it out. Wendy Gritter, be there. Well, welcome to Face, and we have, I have no idea what number we're on, but I think we're around 96. We're getting, maybe this will be the 100th interview. We've got a guest, Wendy Gritter, with us here today. Thanks for joining us today, Wendy.
Well, it's great to be here.
So we're going to get into one of my favorite subjects. We're going to talk about sexuality.
Don't men think about it every 4 seconds or something like that?
Is it every 4? Actually, I thought I broke that record years ago.
Women have a really hard time even imagining that, but apparently it's true.
I bet they do. Yeah, I think it's, there's this great story about, and I'm sure it's sort of a legend in some respects, and Malcolm Muggeridge, at his 72nd or 3rd birthday said, wow, am I ever glad that's over with? And it's just, I have no idea if that's true, but I can sort of appreciate that, because you know what? Then I'm going to get a whole lot more done. Right?
You'd think, yeah. Well, I remember talking to an old missionary who had finally retired, about the same age, and I said, what's the vision for your life now? And he said, to not be a dirty old man. And I remember sort of being shocked, I thought he was going to,
yes,
do something great and spiritual.
Yes, write a new series of biblical commentaries.
Yes, something worthwhile.
Dirty
but
old man wasn't on your list.
Just trying to avoid that. Yep.
Oh, that's funny. Well, it's certainly a topic that I don't think just faith-based folk struggle with, or I think it can be a difficult issue. So before we dig in, and I'm only too willing and eager, tell me a little bit about what you do in the church and what that means. So, as I was sort of driving to our interview today, I was thinking about this whole idea of, just culture-wide, faith-based, religious, there's about 4 or 5 billion religious folk in the world, but you have chosen to work with a certain group, I think. So tell me more about what you do. New Direction. You're the executive director.
Yeah.
Oh, hang on. Little plug for Generous Spaciousness by Wendy Gritter. That's her book, Responding to Gay Christians in the Church, is the subtitle. And it's flying off the digital bookshelves as we speak.
Indeed. Well, I would say that New Direction is open to anyone who is doing some spiritual searching. And usually it's LGBTQ folks who are recovering from some toxic religious experience, whether they've been alienated by a religious family or turfed out of a religious institution, or just in terms of their own spiritual journey, trying to make sense of, can I be authentically who I am and accept and embrace my sexuality as a part of my personhood and have an authentic faith, have an authentic spiritual journey. And so we cultivate communities where people can have those conversations, where they can build relationships, where they can be encouraged in that pursuit. And then we try to help religious institutions, whether that's churches or universities or organizations, to cultivate climates and environments and cultures, really, where those same kinds of conversations can happen. And we call them generously spacious conversations.
So are you working in Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or Jewish communities as well, or is it typically kind of evangelical, conservative Christians?
I would say that the communities that we cultivate are open to people of all faiths. They're predominantly Christian, but we've had Muslim, Hindu, Sikh folks. I mean, it's not necessarily easy to find safe communities for LGBTQ folks in any religious community.
Right.
But in terms of the organizational work we do, we're primarily in the Christian camp.
Do you think there's a reason for that? I mean, maybe it's just the direction of New Direction, or is it a comment on, where we're at in the Toronto area with respect to these issues and faith-based communities?
I think it's a day of partnership and collaboration. And so one of my colleagues was just at the conference for Gay Straight Alliance students and their teacher facilitators and met a really cool Muslim guy who's doing very similar work to what we're doing in the Muslim community. So why would we reinvent the wheel and try to, be something that is not our background? We'd rather work with this guy and ensure that anyone who's seeking support and encouragement will have access to community and friendship and support.
Yeah, and it seems to me there's things to be learned from all communities about these issues, and I would think that typically most religious communities seem to be fairly conservative when it comes to these things, but that's clearly changing because of people like you and the work that you're doing and so on. But I would also think that each community is going to be at a different place. I mean, it's kind of a trite thing to say, but at the same time, it seems like to me that each sort of community's understanding of their creator is going to have an impact on how they deal with their own sexuality.
Well, as the general Canadian social attitudes towards LGBTQ people is increasingly positive, yet we have 40% of our homeless youth connected and identifying as LGBTQ. I mean, it's an estimate, but it's pretty darn high if you think about prevalence being only 5 to 10% of the population. And it's, I think, fair to say that the majority of those kids who are now street involved are either coming from faith-based homes or they're coming from newcomer families where they're coming from an ethnic context that is not prepared to embrace sexual minority persons the way the Canadian culture does. And so there's this conflict. And that means, we have lots of work to do in our wonderfly diverse city and country.
Are we just better at it than other cultures around the world, or are we? Is it part of the reason? Part of the reason for that the diversity of the amount of new Canadians coming to Canada and so on, settling here.
I would be hesitant to say we're better at it. I think we've been forced to be nuanced because of the diversity in Canada. What's interesting as I speak with a variety of families from different ethnic and cultural contexts is that other cultures have a much richer sense of acceptance, but it's just sort of par for the course. Like it's not an issue, which in some ways then perpetuates a bit of a DADT. Don't ask, don't tell. Like we don't really talk about it, but we love people and accept people. And I think what happens in North America is that we have this bent towards authenticity, telling our stories, sometimes labeling, sometimes describing our experiences with high levels of candidness. And so in the North American context, it becomes about being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and that changes the dynamics around acceptance and around integration into the life of a community.
So we're sitting in the Peel region. I believe high school teachers are now on strike.
They are, yes, as of yesterday.
Elizabeth is elementary. They're talking about it. I mean, it's happening. Now, I know that the new curriculum has nothing really to do with the strike, but my wife yesterday, I believe 50% of the students were not at school protesting a new curriculum coming into Ontario that is, for them, hypersexual. that is dealing with issues that a lot of these parents think should be dealt with, at high school level. We just, speaking of the don't ask, don't tell. So what are your thoughts on that? You've got teenagers, you've got kids who've grown up in this culture. You're working in a pretty diverse field. Is this a sign of the times? I mean, considering we're the comment about being better at it, maybe not so much.
Yeah, a lot of parents aren't even necessarily saying leave it for high school. They're saying leave it for the family, leave it for the home context, leave it for the parents to have these conversations. The reality is, though, that very few parents are having those conversations or are ill-equipped to have those conversations in our cultural context. I think what's brilliant about the new curriculum is that it's very focused around respect, consent, agency, kids taking ownership of their own bodies. So it's not just, are we in a sexualized context and are we equipping these kids for sex? It's actually, how are we equipping these kids to protect and honor their own worth and dignity when it comes to their bodies and what others might want to do to their bodies. Having proper names for body parts, being able to understand.
Instead of your thing?
A mom I knew called her son's penis a kangaroo, and it's like,
okay, that's new for me.
Yeah, well,
and I spent years in construction, as you know, and that's a new one for me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, but my 16-year-old daughter was on my Facebook page where the curriculum came up, and she wrote this little essay in the comments about why she felt this curriculum was so important. She and her peers are on YouTube every single day. They are watching educators in the arena of sexuality, and they're saying we need these tools for the kid whose parents are either absent or ashamed of sexuality. These kids need to have an equal level of information for their own protection and sense of dignity within their peer groups.
It seems to me that probably, I don't want to, all sweeping generalizations are wrong, and including this one, but there's probably a lot of parents who don't really know what the curriculum's all about, and they're just kind of jumping on the bandwagon and saying, oh, my friends are upset about it, my church is upset about it, my mother's upset about it, therefore I should be too. For those who have read it, who actually have peeled back some of the layers, do you think some of their reaction has to do with their own sense of shame or guilt or fear at the risk of pointing some fingers? Or, you got to say, well, they're parents too, and, they get to make those decisions if they really want. They get to protest, right? Anyway, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. People are autonomous and free to have their own reactions. I'm not so sure whether it's their own shame, but certainly I think sometimes as parents we want to protect our kids. We want our kids to somehow have an innocence, this sort of caricature of innocence. 1 in 4 8-year-olds has been exposed to explicit sexuality on the internet. Like, that is the reality we live in. And so we might want to think that we can somehow put our kids in a bubble, just as a natural parenting desire for our kids to not be hurt or tarnished or jaded. But I think the curriculum is a very realistic one. It looks at our current context and reality and says our kids need some source of information that is sound, that is going to help them to make wise decisions and choices.
So I'm sure, having a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, we're having these conversations as a family about kind of what's next and how to introduce sexuality topics around. We've had some great conversations. Music, lyrics, all these things, and there's this, I'm going to be 50 in the fall, so already I'm becoming a bit more of a nostalgic old fart than I used to be, thinking, well, gee, I grew up with Van Halen, but holy cow, they weren't so in your face like they are today lyrically, and so on, right? You get into this pattern. Tell me about the slippery slope. Having studied philosophy for years and fallacies and so on, slippery slope comes up quite often, and people kind of toss it out there, especially when we're talking about sexuality. Right?
Indeed,
what's next? What the hell is next, Wendy?
Right.
Where are we going? Well, if we're going to do this, well, then what about this? Isn't that the next thing? So 2 things. What are your thoughts on that? And then secondly, is there anything that kind of scares you about sexuality?
Yeah, I think the slippery slope as a concept somehow presumes that if we don't talk about things, less damage will happen than if we do
Right.
talk
Good.
about
Yeah.
things. And I think that's a complete fallacy. Secrets breed toxicity. Secrets are the fertilizer for shame. Secrets cover up abuse and injustice. And so the idea that we would have open conversation about what humanizes us, about how to extend worth and dignity and respect to all human beings, even those who experience gender and sexuality differently than the majority, is, I think, an opportunity for us to actually reclaim a sense of justice and dignity in the arena of sexuality. We are, I think, blissfully ignorant of the ways that we have been socialized to feel disgust about that which is other. The problem is, as Desmond Tutu said, if I diminish you, I diminish myself. We are interconnected as human beings, and if we do not create environments of justice for all human beings to be in intimate, loving relationships that are protected and given value in our society, then we all lose. And so the notion that if we have this conversation about human dignity and respect, it's going to lead to people marrying their dog, is, I think, intentionally missing the heart of what the conversation is about. It's not just a conversation about more permissiveness. It's actually a conversation about what value do we have as human beings and how can we honor that in one another across our differences. That means we need to make space and make room for those with differing religious convictions, but it also means we need to make room and space for those whose experience of gender and sexuality is different. We need a principled pluralism that doesn't just demand everyone think like me or you're out, but actually says, if I don't honor others who are different than I am, we all lose.
Is this conversation about justice for you then? It's really not, it really doesn't have anything to do with sexuality in some regard. It's almost at a higher or lower level, more foundational than that. Because if you get the justice thing right, if you get the Universal Declaration right, in a sense that all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights, then doesn't some of this other stuff go away to some degree? It becomes footnotes then?
Well, what I think we are lacking is a robust vision of relational justice that people can really dig their teeth into. Sometimes justice seems like this faraway concept that's so overwhelming because we see so much crap in the world, we just don't know where to begin. I think if we understand justice to be, I'm going to participate with others to dismantle the barriers that are preventing them from flourishing. If we're all flourishing, there's going to be less need for the situation we see in Baltimore today. If black youths were not being picked up by cops significantly more often than their white counterparts, if there was flourishing in the arena of jobs and the resources, the practical physical resources that we need, we wouldn't be seeing some of the violence and some of the sort of the out without boundaries kind of behavior that we lament. And so I think absolutely, if we can understand what the vision of human flourishing is, then there's still going to be, deviance and difficulty to address, but we'll be much more equipped to address it. We'll be addressing it from a place of something to offer rather than a place of fear and a place of this is a problem to fix and get rid of, or this is my sister, this is my brother, and together we're going to work towards a more equitable solution that blesses all of us.
A lot of people say we live in a hyper or an over-sexualized culture. The lifestyle advertising, film, magazines, media basically in general, the ubiquity of the image, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's probably true. I forget how many images you and I see a day because of the internet and so on, and driving along the highway. If let's just assume that is true, I'm happy to hear what you have to say about that, but I don't know that we're well sexualized or in a healthy way. So we might be over sexualized to some degree when it covers with respect to images, but I don't hear a lot of people talking about this. I don't go to a lot of dinner parties where, sex becomes a topic. And I mean, maybe we need to be more intentional about that. I don't know. And I kind of get, there's certain sort of the notions of saving face and being polite and all that stuff. But holy cow, I mean, part of the problem is I think we have time. And most of the time we don't. And it's not, well, geez, we'll talk about this stuff in a couple of weeks or maybe at the next dinner party. And isn't this the kind of stuff that makes us human? And I know that's part of my maybe philosophical bent coming out, and most people don't want anything to do with it. But on some, I joke about sex, religion, politics, and death. Those are the 4 things we need to talk about more. Not what was on television last night, or that we watched on YouTube, or the hockey game. Fine, talk about all those things too. Right? So there's a sense in which we're hypersexualized everywhere around us, but it's actually done us a disservice because it's not allowed us to really peel back the layers, ironically, paradoxically.
Well, there's no question that there's a great sense of energy that comes with sex. And so if we are a culture...
I haven't experienced that.
No way. There's this little blue pill I'll tell you about after the podcast. Where our attention span has become minuscule because things are happening so rapidly. And so there's this harnessing of a certain amount of energy in advertising particularly that is going to spark something that catches something in our short attention span. And so it's used and it's overused. What is disastrous to us as a people, though, is that it is utilitarian. It is objectifying. It is not inherently humanizing to any of us. It's trying to harness an energy for a means to the end. And the end is consumerist. The end is, individualist, that we're in our little space alone, outside of community, outside of relationship. What humanizes us is the time it takes to build rapport, to build trust, to build intimacy, to be together. And so you're quite right. I think there are tremendous taboos that still exist. So it is this irony that we have almost an explicitness that's part of our everyday reality, and yet we don't talk about sex at the dinner party, even though 3 of the couples out of 5 haven't been having any sex and are desperately hurting and desperately alone in their marriage that's hanging on by a thread. We don't have that conversation because we're still ashamed. There are still taboos. There's still an uncertainty and an insecurity. And that's because the sexuality that we're bombarded with doesn't humanize us. It doesn't touch our humanity, and that's where we're desperate to have the conversation.
Well, there's a consumeristic edge to it, at the risk of sounding a little too Marxist, I suppose, in some regards. But it's about, again, I don't know, I'm going to blame self-interest a little bit and say it has to do with sex really is about the mechanics of feeling better. And so, and in the moment, I'm gonna take from you, because that's what this transaction is all about. It's not necessarily a relational thing. It's there for my benefit. And so you've got this friends-like approach to sexuality, which is, I know, holy cow, I've dated myself, really, haven't I, just by pulling that. I'm sure there's another, I don't watch a lot of TV these days. So, but Friends, that old sitcom.
Yes, because a whole bunch of people, it went over their heads. What? Friends with benefits?
What's he talking about? Yeah, was that film a few years ago? But the whole idea is that there's this, to me, within this hypersexualized culture of sexuality, there's this casualness that I think also, ironically, can be kind of dehumanizing as well, depending on your starting point, it seems to me. So if you start with the other, if you start with this, we're in this together, this is about building stronger relationships, and as you say, trust and being together, which is a wonderful phrase, I think you've got a better, you're gonna ask better questions, and I think you're going to, I was going to say, behave yourself. But
Yeah.
that's
Well,
that's too moralistic. I don't mean that in that sense.
It's about compartmentalization, right? So we compartmentalize an experience of desire and release as separate from the heart. The problem is that either our heart goes dead and we just don't really feel, and so the compartmentalized orgasm is fun and good, and we don't allow ourselves to feel the brokenness of disconnection, or we're the walking wounded who no longer have a capacity to trust, who no longer feel safe, who aren't able to commit over the long haul because we're going to hurt you before you hurt us. These are the ramifications of this kind of reductionism, but we don't talk about it. We don't talk about that pain. We just get a better divorce lawyer.
I remember years ago being in a conversation with somebody, or maybe I wasn't, I was probably too young, but standing on the outside of it. And there was a grandson who was not being validated for X or Y, and I don't know what it was. And the reason is that if we validate him too much, he's going to become this egomaniacal nut job, basically. It's a horrible paraphrase.
Yeah, he'll get too big for his britches.
Right.
Now I'm dating myself.
Yeah, and I think I grew up in that culture as well. And I wondered, and now today it seems like the pendulum has swung completely the other way. So we see this really crummy drawing by some kid with the crayons and go, wow, that's a good job, right? I actually think the pendulum over there is way better than on the other side. But I wonder to what degree we've viewed sexuality in the same way. Geez, let's not talk about that. Let's just sweep this under the carpet. Better under the carpet than out in my face. Because, wow, I bet we're back to the slippery slope again, right? This idea that, oh, geez, if we talk about this too much, oh, man, what are the implications? And we don't think trust, and we don't think rapport. I mean, I guess what I find a little hard for me to come to terms with is for something that's so supposedly, and believe me, I'm here, profoundly human, we have such a hell of a time with. Like, what's going on?
Well, it was interesting. Your image of the pendulum right away brought me to the moment of rites of passage. You know, so the kid gets taken out into the forest and he's left overnight.
Right.
So there is both this incredible empowerment and risk. And on one hand, we either, are so afraid of empowerment that we leave a kid bereft, or on the other hand, we're so afraid of risk that they don't have the chops to face their own sense of entitlement. And whether that's in the arena of sexuality or just coming of age or being able to be a responsible citizen, we have a really hard time in that paradoxical place of tension where it's both empowerment and risk, because people get hurt. It's hard, it's painful, it's tiring. It takes time, of which is, the most sought after commodity. I think people just don't have time. They're busy running here and there and doing many, many activities, but don't take the time to really understand, what is it to be human for myself and then for those that I have some degree of influence and connection with.
So you work primarily, back to sort of come back this to not finish the circle, but to bring it back a little bit in this whole faith-based community. You work primarily, it seems, within the sort of the evangelical church. What kind of pushback are you getting today about, having authentic conversations about sexuality in the church, about welcoming in the very communities that have been pushed out for so many years? And then why bother? Yeah. There's
still tremendous pull between a call to justice and a call to purity, a call to living a life of freedom marked by virtue and character, or a life of obedience and rule keeping. So that's a huge tension that.
For you personally, or you mean for the groups that you seem to be working with?
No, I've just gotten off the treadmill entirely. But
Right.
but certainly those who are living with that tension will tend to see us too far to the left, too permissive, and particularly in traditionally believing or evangelical communities that pull to obedience, to rule keeping is very strong, holiness, purity. I think that another huge tension is the question of authority. Where do we find our authority? If we're being challenged on a literalistic reading of our sacred text, then what is authoritative? And in a Christian context, there can be, I think, a tension between Scripture as our sacred text and this notion of the Spirit. The Spirit blows where it will. The Spirit is this power that isn't easily put in a box or controlled or contained. And so when we, for instance, challenge a parent or a clergy person that they might need to entrust a given individual, an LGBTQ person, to the Spirit, to own, clarify, and live in alignment with the values and beliefs that they wrestle and grapple with and define for themselves. Right away, there's a sense of, oh, then we'll just do what's right in our own eyes, which is a quote from one of the books, Judges, where it was problematic because people just did whatever they wanted to. So these are some of the tensions. Where's our authority? How is it that we're supposed to live as human beings who have a commitment to a system of faith? And I think the human nature in religion is to try to somehow, it's fundamental to earn, to make sure that we're deserving, to somehow say, we've done enough. And for many Christian people, there's this, lurking idea of grace and gift and freedom and love, and it's attractive perhaps, but it seems too good to be true.
Why can't Christians, why can't the church just spend more time being together, building trust, building rapport? Why the heck do they have to get it right all the time?
Yeah, well, Jesus said the summary of all this stuff is to love God and love your neighbor. And somehow that just, we seem to need to complicate that.
Well, this polarization, and it's not just the church. It's scientists, it's philosophers, it's all the liberal arts. Frankly, we want to polarize it. We want it's right, it's wrong, it's in, it's out, it's this way, it's that way. And as a teacher at Humber College in International Development, students do not like the lack of precision when it comes to what sustainable development actually means. What does it mean to be participatory? What does it mean to be just from a gender perspective? What does it mean to see the world through a gender lens? And they want to go online to Wikipedia, they want to go to the Funkin' Wagnall, the dictionary, and give me the answer. What's on the test? I want a good mark. It's not about rapport and trust and relationship. And it's a profound irony, a frustration for me as a teacher, and also a real challenge. I'm not saying every student's that way.
Sure. But we certainly have an intrinsic reward system. What is rewarded? Well, certainty is rewarded. The right answer is rewarded. The winner of the argument is rewarded. And many people of faith are trying to recover a sense of paradox and mystery, a humility that acknowledges that this is too vast for us to contain in our answer box. But post-enlightenment, we're driven to have the absolute right, truthful answer. And I think in international development or in the arena of sexuality, the complexity overwhelms us. And nobody wants to sit with that emotional sense of helplessness. And so we are driven to find what will fix this problem, which ultimately is just about us feeling better sometimes.
It really is. Wouldn't it? Scott Peck, no relation. Scott Peck says in Road Less Traveled that the sin in the Garden of Eden was laziness. It was laziness. Whether or not you believe the story or not, I don't really care. I think that's a really interesting observation. They didn't go deep enough. They didn't ask enough questions.
Yeah.
And is that kind of what we're suffering from here? This whole, all of us sweeping things under the carpet. Geez, the curriculum, holy mackerel, don't want to talk about that. That's just too hard. It's just too hard.
Kathleen Norris is a writer and has written a book called Acedia and Me. And we've perhaps heard of the 7 deadly sins, but Kathleen would say that actually before those were formed into these concrete actions, it was the deadly thoughts. It was the things that mire us up. And acedia was one of them. And it was this sort of place of lethargy, this place of apathy, this place of, it would happen to the monk in the afternoon when they were supposed to pray and they were just like, screw it. I'm hungry. I want sex. I want these escapes from the challenge of being contemplative, being present to what is happening right now, to my own humanity, to the humanity of others, to the reality in the world, to listening intently for what my small but significant part might be, and then be faithful to do it. We want something bigger. We want something grander. We want something more immediate. We want something more intense. That is the human heart.
The New Testament says that divorce is wrong. I don't want to get into a moralistic debate here with you, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of this because I think it's deeply connected. So, Dante certainly would say that divorce is wrong, and I think he's got a pretty special place in hell for me, actually. And I'm a magician as well, so they were condemned in the book of Leviticus. So, by the way, I'm being stoned today at 2:05 p.m. if you want to come to the stoning. Yeah, it's happening at the Civic Center in Mississauga. Anyway, so I'm screwed, basically, is what I'm saying.
Do you have a tattoo?
You know what? I don't.
Well, get on that, would you?
Victoria will not let me get my daughter 7. I can't grow any hair, and I'm not allowed to get tattoos. And no earrings, no piercings. So I joked with her the other day. I had a nipple ring, and that didn't go over too well. Sweetie, wait till you see my new... Anyway, so I guess my point... So if it's a right and wrong thing, if it's polarized, well, I mean, even if I was this moralistic sort of anti-gay activist... How can I say anything as any kind of believer if I've stepped so far already outside of the moral code, right? And I guess it's that whole literal, I mean, you commented about interpretation earlier and so on, authority. We're back to authority and being children of the Enlightenment. Now what the heck do we do?
Yeah. And again, it is that push and pull between justice and purity. And if we choose the purity route, then we have to do these weird... sort of religious gymnastics, I call them, to find these crazy exceptions. And so one denomination, agonized over the fact that the rate of divorce was so high that if they weren't allowing people who were divorced and remarried, like the churches would be empty. And so they rationalized it this way. As long as a couple repents the first time they have sex, then the rest of the times they have sex, it's not adultery. Because divorce and remarriage was seen as adulterous unless there were these certain conditions. Now, doesn't that just seem ridiculous to you? But if you choose the rule-keeping track, you gotta find these weird exceptions to try to make things okay. If you are on the justice track, so to speak, then you say, in what ways was divorce perpetuating injustice? In a patriarchal context, where misogyny was rampant and women who were rejected, abandoned, divorced were left bereft, probably needing to resort to prostitution to be able to just survive. What does justice mean for a sexual minority person in a reality today of our understanding, limited as it may be, around sexual orientation, around intrinsic difference? What does justice look like? Is a relational God really asking an entire population of people to abstain from sexual relationship? Not just sex, but sexual relationships. what does that look like in terms of justice? Well, it's a very different question, and your thought develops very differently than sort of the strange, convoluted rule keeping that needs to try to find exceptions that really don't make very much sense. And so we poo-poo when people say, well, do you eat shellfish and do you wear polyester? Because those are things that are contraindicated in Leviticus, as is,
card tricks.
Men who have sex with men. And so those who are on the rule-keeping track would say, well, come on, that's not a big deal. But this is a big deal.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't, it's not cohesive. It doesn't cohere.
Seafood fettuccine special last night just before.
Well, it's Shrimp Fest at Red Lobster.
I didn't know that.
Go out and get it now while it's hot.
I'm kind of a crab guy myself. What does it mean to be heteronormative?
Yeah, you view the world through the lens of male-female coupling is the way to be human and the way to exist as family units. And so
but isn't that the right way?
Well, it is the majority experience. But does the majority make it the only right way to be human? Does, for instance, the creation account in Genesis that talks about male and female, is that descriptive of the majority experience or prescriptive for every human being? Well, the truth is, it doesn't actually say in the creation account whether it's descriptive or prescriptive. And so you can fight about that till the cows come home, but you might need to live with some tension and some paradox and some mystery, and different people are going to grab hold of a different conclusion for different reasons. So one of the things we do in Generous Spaciousness is say, look, we got to find a way to be human together, because if we're going to hold our breath until we get this resolved, it's not going to happen, right? For the host of reasons in which we think about things differently, we develop our thought differently, we develop our conclusions differently, we have to find a way to be able to humanize one another, to live at peace with one another, and work as much as we can towards justice in this imperfect and incomplete reality.
In some ways, and I think I love this, do we need to just listen more? Do we need to become better listeners?
Well, it's a huge, huge factor in the process. And listening, I would
because
even...
it presupposes a certain humility, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It says that...
I don't have the answers. I don't know. Tell me your story.
Well, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong.
Right.
I don't think I'm wrong, but I could be wrong. Or even just the sense of, I will temporarily suspend my strong opinions. I'll temporarily suspend my assumptions so that I can enter into your experience, anticipating that I might learn more about this reality than I previously knew. And that takes extraordinary humility. It's a huge risk, because what if I change my mind? Heaven forbid. And so it actually takes a tremendous amount of courage. People often talk about my work as being wishy-washy or a compromise, because I'm trying to bring people who are different together in a place of dialogue where we really can humanize one another. And I'm like, wishy-washy? Obviously you haven't tried it, because it's extraordinarily challenging and will cost you, emotionally and spiritually, and just in terms of your own sense of security and certainty, it will cost you everything to humanize the one with whom you disagree.
Are you, we got to wrap up here in a couple of minutes, but would you say you're a hopeful person? I mean, are things changing? I mean, I'm all about social change. I'm all about incremental steps and so on, and making the world a better place through the little things. And I do think things are changing from an international perspective, from a social justice perspective, and so on. Lots of differences, lots of changes, pros and cons. Do you get out of bed with a smile in the morning? Or do you put up your boots? Or do you put on your boxing gloves?
Yeah. Well, we won't talk about my personal emotional state of mind.
There's medication for that, Wendy.
Yeah, and I'm on them. But I would say that I'm very intentional to cultivate hopefulness. And it isn't dependent on whether things are changing or not.
So it's not situational.
Well, the deal is you cannot be part of changing things unless you cultivate hopefulness. Like if you're a pessimist that says, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, then get the hell out of advocacy work, because you're just
Yeah.
a downer to everybody
Well,
else.
get out of my way. That's what I say. That's like my new T-shirt. Get out
Yeah,
of my way.
I mean,
Yeah.
and so I'm very intentional to say, you know, and I'm a person of faith. So if I say we're created in the image of a power greater than us that created the world to be good, and because of that we have inherent worth and dignity, then how can I not be hopeful that we can find one another in that we can humanize one another? And I think that will radically change things around if we actually look at the person we are most different from and see in them a person worthy of dignity
There's
and respect.
something about similarity through difference, and I'm not just trying to be clever, but there really is. We are all the same, but so radically different in our own understanding, the lens, the experience, the stories, what we bring to the conversation. And it seems that history has shown we're all scared out of our minds because of that. And yet, hopefully, the way forward is going to be saying, hang on, I can validate that. I can affirm that. I can embrace that. I can include that and go from there.
Well, those of us in the West, with all of our wealth and privilege, think we have the answers for everything. And it's difficult to live as a humble people. We're wired to set up our accomplishments, which inevitably breeds pride and arrogance. But I am constantly humbled by examples like Rwanda. I mean, these are people decimated by genocide who enact reconciliation by humanizing one another that has revolutionized and transformed a nation that was just completely done. You know, if we don't have the humility to see what can happen when we humanize one another, we are then part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Hey, listen, we have a right to be arrogant. This is a culture that's created craft dinner, Big Brother, and what's one more we can toss in there?
Microwaves.
There you go. I mean, come on. Really?
Yeah.
That's something to be proud of, isn't it, Wendy? Wendy Gritter joining us today. Her book, Generous Spaciousness, Responding to Gay Christians in the Church. It's available at your bookstores, online. And thanks a lot for joining us today. I mean, talk about, barely scratching the surface, but really enjoyed having a chat today.
Fun time.